At just a bit past the 8-minute mark of the fantastic 6th episode of House of the Dragon's second season, Rhaenyra tells Stefan Darklyn that she finds herself in an impossible situation. It's something that's been going around because on the other side of the conflict, we've already seen that Alicent is also in one. Aemond and Vhagar are a problem that Rhaenyra has to deal with. He gives the Greens an unmistakable advantage, and has already killed one of her largest dragons and one of her closest advisors. Time isn't necessarily on her side either now that One Eye has been named Prince Regent, especially since Rhaenyra's most seasoned dragon and experienced rider, who also happens to be her current husband, is taking himself off the board. He might be recruiting a land army to fight for her claim in the Riverlands, but it doesn't feel like she can count on that since he's currently incommunicado. As viewers, we have more information than she does, and still can't be sure. In episode 5, it appeared that Alice Rivers, the potion she gave him, the castle itself, or all of the above had him acting somewhat out of character. That's something we'll come back to because I think that whole situation is starting to make more sense, but Rhaenyra can probably trust her instinct to proceed as if she stands alone for now. At the end of the last episode, Jace came up with a good idea since their problem is not a lack of dragons. It's that they don't have anyone in the immediate family to ride them. At the end of season 1, we saw Daemon sing a song to one of Dragonstone's unclaimed dragons, Vermithor. Silverwing is another unclaimed dragon that lives on Dragonstone, and the two of them are unique in that they're a mated pair. These were the mounts of King Jaehaerys I and his sister wife Queen Alicent. The Conciliator and the Good Queen both hatched their dragons. Jaehaerys rode Vermithor into King's Landing to claim the throne and to mark the end of his uncle Maegor the Cruel's reign. That's a whole other story. But no one's claimed Vermithor or Silverwing since, and because dragons continue to grow throughout their lives, they're both of formidable size at nearly 100 years old. So getting riders for these dragons is a clear path out of the impossible situation. Also, a rider for Laenor's old mount, Seasmoke, who we've seen has become restless and taken to flying around Dragonstone and nearby Driftmark. Unfortunately for Rhaenyra, and even more so for the first attempted rider, Stefan Darklyn, this plan goes up in flames. The scene was really well put together though. The singing, the cool dragon tamer woman who's telling him what to do, the physical space, this hangar type area where they can mount the dragons as they emerge from the dragon mount, a place that's now connected to the memory of Rhaenys and Meleys every time we see it, R.I.P. The fear, the way Seasmoke bends his neck to give everyone the false sense that things might finally be turning around for the Blacks, after a very frustrating run of episodes where Rhaenyra hasn't been able to manufacture a win, and then the reality of how dangerous the dragons are when Sir Stefan loses his life. The thing about what she tells him to set this all up is that they really don't know what will happen. There are zero mentions in the histories of a Targaryen princess or princeling dying while they were trying to claim one of the family's dragons. There is one example when Arya Targaryen claimed Balerion the Black Dread after Maegor died that went wrong. She was able to claim the Conqueror's old mount, but couldn't control it. It flew to Valyria and was just gone for a year. It then returned injured with a sick Arya who died shortly after. And after that, they decided to keep the dragons in the dragon pit. Other than that, they mostly just do what we saw Aemond do in season 1, which Laena also did when she was still young, and they both claimed the oldest and most dangerous dragon around. The show added this bit in episode 5 about Rhaena almost dying the last time she tried to claim a dragon, and Corlys confirmed that she was trying to claim the dragons there. Though that seems to serve as an explanation as to why they wouldn't let her try first more than anything else. The belief is that you have to have the blood of old Valyria or the blood of the dragon to become a rider, and the Targaryens that have ruled have essentially played gatekeepers so that their children are the only people who have access. I like that the show added the detail that this all comes from Valyrian sources, which would be biased and try to paint them as something closer to gods than men. Can't blame them for gatekeeping either, as we're starting to see each dragon is like a nuke, and when the rules of mutually assured destruction are no longer a thing, that is when dragon lords fight other dragon lords instead of subjugating non-dragon riding lords and ordinary citizens, you wouldn't want just anyone to have one in their arsenal. Except in exactly this situation if you were Rhaenyra, who knows that she'll die as will her entire family if she can't win the war. Stefan's situation was unique in that he was highborn. We saw his father, the Lord of Duskendale, executed by Criston Cole in episode 4, but Stefan was also sworn to protect and serve as a member of the Queen's Guard. Other highborn candidates, if they're out there, might not have been so quick to jump at this opportunity. Everyone should be afraid that Vhagar and Aemond will show up on their doorstep in the same way the Freys were when Jace went to meet with them. So you might think if they were the adventurous type and had some of that special magic blood, why wouldn't they want to ride around on a dragon? I think for some of these highborns, the problem might get back to the reason she needs riders in the first place. The job description involves fighting Vhagar. These people all have stuff to lose, so it would take the right kind of person to be willing to sign up for that in the first place. That's a lot of talking to say the dragons are mysterious and no one really knows how the bonding works exactly or what motivates them. You hear lots of things from the lore repeated as truths, and we'll get into one of those at the end of the episode, but the bottom line is that everyone is just making educated guesses. I mentioned that Vermithor and Silverwing are a mated pair. There's an idea that through their bond, a dragon is influenced by their rider's personality. So it makes sense that given Jaehaerys and Alicent were in love, that their dragons might be as well. After all, they're just taking cues from their riders, and even after they die, those impressions persist. It's much more complicated than that, though, since lots of dragon riders have been married, and there aren't many other examples of their dragons having that same kind of bond. Daemon and Viserys' parents, Balon and Alyssa, rode Vhagar and Meleys when they were married, and there's no mention that the dragons were a pair. Is this because Vhagar had different riders going back to the conquest, or because Jaehaerys and Alicent both hatched their dragons who then grew up together? There are any number of factors you could focus on. And they were both claimed by different riders, and you know what happened when they met on the battlefield at Rook's Rest. The point is that the dragons and their lore are written as being mysterious. It's never just laid out as fact. So when you get to a question of does Rhaenyra's egg not hatching or her trying to claim the dragons that Dragonstone means she'll never be a dragon rider, it kind of makes it seem like there's something wrong with her specifically since she's literally twins with Baela who both hatched an egg and rides a dragon, but at the same time she might just have bad luck. And that could sound like I'm being facetious, but I'm not, because as I've mentioned, it's complicated, so you can't be sure. Either way, to get back to the episode, Rhaena learns from Lady Jane that she'll be able to leave the Vale to take Viserys and Aegon onto Pentos to fulfill her duty to Rhaenyra. This would have been good news since she appeared somewhat miserable there. The only part of her conversation we hear with Joffrey is her telling him some of them will serve in smaller ways even if they're not what they would choose for themselves. Nothing says I'm doing great like unloading your problems on a 6-year-old who just wants his mommy. Then it gets interesting though because she comes across a burnt area in the field littered with sheep bones and charred carcasses. This explains why Lady Jane was so insistent on getting a full-grown dragon in exchange for her army, even though that's a pretty big ask if you think about it. It turns out that recently a large wild dragon relocated to the area, ranging more broadly than normal in search of food. As far as how the show introduces it, it makes sense, but this is also something I'll come back to later. For now, they leave things in the Vale with Rhaena and the small children and the super cool looking hatchling who makes an appearance all set to go. Rhaena is clearly conflicted about the situation though. While the first attempt to add more dragon riders to their roster led to disaster, things go much better with Myssaria's plan to jumpstart a whisper campaign among King's Landing's small folk. In a series of scenes, Mysaria gives Rhaenyra reports that things are underway, and we see Diana and Sylvie stoking dissent in the tavern. Ulfhil, you'll remember, claims to be the bastard brother of Viserys and Daemon, is their mark when we watch it play out. The show's done a good job showing how regular people are suffering under the blockade through the scenes of Hugh and his wife. And there's a great scene in this episode. After the hawker has run out of food for the day, they all sort of turn and drool as sheep to feed the dragons are carted through the streets. You realize what an impact the boats full of food that arrive with Rhaenyra's banners have when they show up later, and how desperate things have gotten when you see Hugh, who for all intents and purposes has been introduced as a good person, beats a man to get food for his family. Mysaria has proven herself to be useful, and throughout the episode, it starts to feel like she's the only person Rhaenyra can talk to. Part of that is because Daemon's gone, and she's tired of being reminded she needs him. There's a back and forth with Jace, who's also been stepping up, that ends in a bad place because she interprets him saying they need to figure out the Daemon and Caraxes situation as him doubting her ability to win. The show sets up a nice parallel where Daemon knows he should reach out to Rhaenyra as well, but just doesn't want to. Episode 5 went as far as hinting that he was starting to have designs on taking power for himself, which was a little difficult to process because even though he was a jealous second son who felt he would be a better king than his brother, he always defaulted to loyalty when push came to shove. This threw me off some because on the one hand, I think Mysaria is spot on when she says that Daemon only does what suits him. But that's only part of the picture. I think it also makes sense for Rhaenyra to fear what he might do given the stakes. But what the White Worm responds to that with, that it's more his way to disappear, is more to the point, and it provides some clarity that Rhaenyra can't access while caught up in their relationship. Sometimes when you run away or disappear in Westeros, you find yourself under the influence of a cursed castle or a woods witch. I audibly chuckled as Daemon was scrambling to get away from Harrenhal and turned to deadpan the line, "There's something wrong with me, someone poisoned me." Because it's just like, buddy, don't you remember the potion that this person right here gave you? The one you took a sip of and then woke up in a different room on a different day completely disoriented? Maybe he doesn't remember. The thing that makes this work on the surface is that he has this aversion to all things related to dreams and prophecies, because he saw that as one of Viserys' weaknesses, but then also feels resentful because he never told him about the Song of Ice and Fire. Either way, I've been a little stumped as to how the show's been developing Alice's motivations, and I think this episode finally helped to reframe that at least some. Keep in mind, I'm saying that knowing how things play out in the book for the character and trying to avoid spoilers. Because Daemon's grip on reality has been compromised since he arrived at Harrenhal, the show's had some fun playing with the idea that maybe Alice doesn't exist at all and is just a figment of Daemon's imagination or hallucinations or what have you. Luckily, it put that to rest at the end of this episode when Sir Simon mentions that Alice Rivers is indeed the healer at Harrenhal and offered her services at Riverrun when Lord Grover Tully reached the end of his life. That's a relief since she is a historical figure in the universe that book readers like me knew existed. So while he was definitely tripping and some of what was going on happened in dreams, the real mysteries about Alice come from the different descriptions of her from Fire and Blood that all agree she was mysterious, and things like the actor saying her character was very powerful and might be hundreds of years old. I've gone over that stuff in previous videos, so to sum it up here, is Alice Rivers weird because she's at Harrenhal, or is she at Harrenhal because she's weird? Is she a bastard of Lionel Strong, or was she his wet nurse and also the wet nurse of his sons, and somehow no one found it odd that she hadn't aged in all those years? Those are all good questions the show might eventually shed light on. But as far as episode 6 is concerned, it's really more about Daemon. It finally gives us the thing we've all been waiting for. A Paddy Considine appearance, if not a cameo. I've watched it a couple of times and I'm not sure that they actually brought Paddy in to film any of it, but still happy to see him involved. The first dream is mostly a flashback to when he sent Daemon away at the end of the series premiere. We hear him repeat the question, asking if he really said the heir for a day line. Viserys is talking about his son Balon, who died after his wife Emma died giving birth. Viserys himself gave the maesters the go-ahead to try a cesarean section, knowing that she wouldn't survive, which made this the major regret he struggled with for the rest of his life. The shots here are from different angles, and at times who we're watching is reversed from the first time we saw him say these things. And for what it's worth, it looks like a new scene, but I don't know why they'd bring the actor back to have him say the exact same words. It does continue the theme of these visions being tied to Daemon's regrets and being forced to reckon with things from his past. He never attempts to answer or address his brother directly, opting instead to try to run away, only finding the doors to the throne room locked so that he's stuck there. He wakes up as Sir Simon opens the doors to the dining room and then proceeds to threaten him with a blade after being asked if he's been getting enough sleep. He accuses Simon of being an agent of the Hightowers, his nephew Larys, and even that Rhaenyra herself put him up to it. And it's clear to everyone, including himself, that he's cracking up, so he tries to leave before running into Alice in the God's Eye. Later in the second dream, we see Viserys crying over Aemma and Balon's bodies. Daemon goes to comfort him and tells him he's sorry. He holds his brother as he sobs and continues that he's sorry because he needed him, assuring him that he's there now. Then he's woken up by Sir Simon with the news from Riverrun. What's interesting about the two dreams with Viserys is that the second one isn't something he regrets or haunts him. It's him coming to terms with what he should have done in that situation. It shows self-awareness and progress. And for a character who's been literally stuck for the past few episodes, it opens the door to moving forward, as does the death of Grover Tully. We may not always be able to trust Alice's motivations, but I think we can trust what she told him about the Rivermen. They're made of mud and would rather die stuck in it than yield 1 inch to one another. That's why the Tullys have been necessary to hold things together, and the time for subtlety around Daemon's next steps has passed. Alice told him things would change in 2 days. She was on her way to try to assist Grover's maesters. He's now dead, which means that little Oscar Tully is now the Lord Paramount of Riverrun. And that means Daemon has the opportunity to bring all the Riverlands fighting men together under Rhaenyra's banner. I mean, presumably her banner, right? Now that the psychedelic experience is winding down, we can expect him to move past his thoughts of taking power for himself. The point was personal growth, right? A type of location therapy or something along those lines. I'm not saying it's over yet, because I don't know what comes next. But I am saying that it's playing as though he had some things to work out, and that his time there forced him to do that. Remember, the story of Black Heron that Alice brought up in their first real conversation is about hubris and excess. Harrenhal is a monument to that, and the curse is supposed to be responsible for the extinction of every house that held it before the Strongs. Daemon came there for an army which is now waiting on the other side of his strange detour. How much of both of those things Alice is responsible for is the big question, as is what she might want in return when they see each other again. I half expected Alfred Broom to be there when Simon woke him up the second time. The way it looks now, he can chalk up the delay to Grover's health, and they can get down to the business of facing the Greens once he gets there. There isn't much time, though, because Aemond is out to prove he's a much more decisive ruler than his brother. The episode opened with shots of troops flying the Lannister Golden Lion. This was mentioned in the background when Alicent was losing it at the small council meeting after Aemond was named regent, and we met Tywin's twin brother Jason Lannister during the hunt scene in Season 1 where he tried to scoop up Rhaenyra with a marriage proposal. I've been talking about Second Son energy a lot this season, and theirs is a really interesting manifestation of this. They're twins, but because Jason came out first, he's the heir to Casterly Rock, while Tywin has to settle for being Master of Coin in King's Landing. We see Jason's troops arrive at House Lefford's castle, Goldentooth. Theirs is a Westerman family you really would have never heard of before. I'm not saying they're unimportant. I'm just saying they never showed up in Game of Thrones or whatever. Their men are ready to fight for their liege lord, who has also put together an impressive host. But Jason tells him to send a raven to the regent saying they'll march to Harrenhal as soon as he shows up to escort them with Vhagar. When it gets there, the message infuriates Aemond. But as Tywin points out, there is a large dragon named Caraxes in the Riverlands. The transfer of power that transpired when he picked up the small ball in the last episode isn't lost on the Prince Regent. He's aware that his new role means that people have to do what he says. As the council tries to push back against his plan, he just quickly gives each of them something to do and keeps going. Thailand is tasked with allying with the Triarchy to attempt to break the blockade. After suffering the indignity of being offered as a bargaining chip, getting married off to a Greyjoy to bring the Iron Fleet over to their side, Alicent seals her fate by pointing out that the Triarchy can't be trusted, saying this is something his father understood, and Cole gets himself sent to Harrenhal. He has issues with the idea, primarily that he no longer has the men to go up against Daemon if he can successfully rally the Rivermen to his cause. But Aemond just assures him that he'll join the battle when the time is ripe. The Lannisters will attack from the west, forcing them to fight on two fronts, and he adds that his uncle is a challenge he welcomes if he dare face him. He dismisses everyone with a classic "I see we're all agreed," while informing Alicent he'd like her to stay behind so they can have a one-on-one. He asks her to remind him of her role on the council, which is almost surprising considering we view Alicent as one of the central characters. The reality is that she sat in for Viserys when he needed it and was there on Aegon's request. And as Aemond points out, they're both gone. She makes a plea as an experienced politician and then as his mother, and ultimately he relieves her of her duty so that she'll have more time for domestic pursuits. How well this works to make me feel for Alicent is somewhat surprising. I mean, she's far from perfect and not a good person generally, but you could always assign some of that to what she's had to endure coming of age in this system. But this is a little more compelling because it's partially of her own making. She made a decision to put her son on the throne, which required her to buy into the idea that men would never agree to be ruled by a woman. And then just last episode was shocked when they wouldn't let her rule. Then she takes it out on her low-born boyfriend, telling him she didn't permit him to say her name as a way to remind him of his place. It makes her more relatable and frankly makes her current situation a sad thing to behold. They're pulling off the same thing with Aegon. Nobody's choice for king except the people who needed him for their coup. And now you sympathize with him as he suffers at Aemond's hand. Orwell tells the council that he's regained consciousness and is doing much better, so One Eye makes a beeline to see what he can recall about his accident. He promises he remembers nothing. Aemond inflicts a little extra pain to instill fear, and then basically tells the Grand Maester to keep him incoherent on Milk of the Poppy. That prevents Aegon from telling Alicent about what happened when she goes to sit with him. But Larys slips in before he's about to get his next dose. And man, this guy is nothing if not reliable. This is after Larys brought up the idea of Aemond needing a new hand and getting the fake out that, yeah, I'll give you the responsibility, ... to go tell my Uncle Otto to come back and be hand again. I'm actually looking forward to his return. And not just because Rhys Ifans is a great actor, but, well, maybe it's mostly about that, but just like the first time he was sent away, he's been missed. And they didn't even have a good replacement like Lionel Strong to step up this time. That'll be good news for Alicent, who apparently hasn't heard from her father either. This is also kind of exciting because he's the type of guy who sends ravens non-stop, so if he's being quiet, there has to be a good reason. If nothing else, his silence gives his children a chance to bond in the yard before Gwayne heads to Harrenhal. There's a sense that they're riding to their doom, but he gives her nice words about her youngest son before they leave. They've been bringing him up a lot more lately, and here we learn that Daeron is 16 now and sounds like he's turning into a real dragon rider heartthrob. It's heavily implied that not growing up in King's Landing has been for the better, which makes Alicent rightfully wonder if it's not growing up in the place or not growing up with her as his mother. And if we're talking about the way the show has managed to make the Greens all pretty good, complicated characters that you're really not rooting for but still can catch some feelings over, how about Gwayne, who didn't make a great first impression? And what about sulking Cole standing over there all by himself? Can they really pull that one off? I mean, for me, in my last video, I already mentioned how his speech about the horrors of dragon warfare got to me. But what stuck with me after the fact was that line about not giving him leave to say her name. But yeah, to get back to Larys's move. He has the nurse hold back on Aegon's dose so he can get in there and work his magic. He explains to him that he will recover, but never be the same. For instance, Orwell has done what he could to set that nasty compound fracture we saw last episode, but he'll never be able to run again. His mind should be fine, and Larys points out that people will underestimate him because of his disabilities. Something he understands well and seizes on to put Aegon in a place where he's dependent on his help. After Alicent sees her brother and estranged lover off to war, she visits everyone's favorite green, Helena, who it appears keeps crickets or something similar in tiny cages like pets. Imagine those are a lot cheaper to have on screen than a scene showing her, I don't know, riding or even standing next to her dragon Dreamfire. Now that she has more time for domestic pursuits, Alicent gets her daughter to tag along for a trip to the Sept to light a candle for Aegon. Their timing couldn't be worse, because this was just after Rhaenyra's food delivery started making its way through the streets. It makes for an exciting scene as they're pelted with vegetables and insults from the fired up crowd. It also exposes the mistake that Aegon made by naming his buddies to the Kingsguard, and things get rowdy when one of them cuts off a man's arm who tries to grab Alicent. The small folk eventually get him to pay for his poor judgment, as the queens are whisked away to safety. It's a great way to underline Mysarea's claim that there are other ways to fight wars, and on this front, the Blacks appear to be winning. This might help to get her council back on her side, which has been an obvious problem for Rhaenyra for the whole season so far. That kind of boiled over in a short scene with Bartimos Celtigar that ended with a pretty satisfying slap, and this disclaimer that it's her fault she thinks that he's forgotten to fear her. I guess ideally you don't want her walking around slapping people, but this one felt justified. I didn't mention it before because he didn't contribute much on his first day on the job, but Corlys did arrive on Dragonstone to become the Hand of the Queen. Where there was more happening in his story was with his bastards Alan and Adam. Undoubtedly, because of the last conversation we saw him have with Rhaenys, he offers Alan the post of first mate on his next excursion. He tries to decline the offer respectfully, but Corlys ends up making it a command, so he has no choice but to take the job. Alan has a sort of wrap tied around his head in this scene, covering up his baldness, which always stood out as a strange choice for a man of his age. Later, when we see the brothers at home, we see that he keeps it shaved to hide the fact that he has silver hair like his father, which isn't a big surprise at this point, but still a cool detail. He doesn't want to get his hopes up, which makes sense. They've been right there all this time, and Corlys has never acknowledged they were his sons. Adam, who says that the sea snake ignores him completely, still encourages his brother to take advantage of the opportunity. After all, with all the talk of the heir to Driftmark being of salt and sea, he would actually be a good candidate if Corlys followed the advice from Rhaenys and legitimized him. A little later, while Adam is fishing, Seasmoke shows up and appears to be chasing him. There was another scene a few episodes back where Adam saw Laenor's old mount in this area, but this encounter probably feels like it's coming out of nowhere and sends him running for his life. I mean, what else would you do in that situation? He eventually falls down and briefly thinks he might have gotten away, and then Seasmoke lands right in front of him, and the scene cuts away as the dragon closes in. I spent some time reviewing this episode's trailer and had a pretty good idea of how things would play out. The one thing I got completely wrong though was the scene at the end where Rhaenyra mounts Syrax. Given Daemon's absence and that he was completely lost in it in the last episode, I guess she was probably heading to Harrenhal. As I've laid out, that turns out to be the last thing she wants to do. But even going into this final scene, when Mysaria started to push back on what she was saying about Daemon, I expected it would get her to change her mind, and the episode would end with her leaving. Of course, the cliffhanger with Adam changed things up a little bit, but even though it played out completely differently in the book, he does eventually claim Seasmoke. That just felt like a nice twist, because it's fun when they can surprise you even when you know what's going to happen. happen. I mentioned before that throughout the episode it started to stand out how Mysaria was turning into the only person she can count on, so they actually set this up, but I really didn't see this kiss coming. Everything is there when you go back and look, and maybe I was just too focused on the things I was expecting to happen, but now we're here. And it's kind of exciting, at least more exciting than watching Rhaenyra flounder and get nowhere with her small council. In the book, the White Worm becomes her unofficial master of whispers, but it isn't until later, and her connection is still mostly associated with Daemon when she's mentioned. So yeah, I didn't expect this, but I'm curious to see where they take it. Mysaria is definitely contributing and tipping the scales in their direction in her role as an advisor. And the scene where she gets vulnerable, telling her the story of her scar, had a real impact. I think her feelings and attraction play is sincere, but given her history and that she provided information to Otto when it benefited her in the past, it wouldn't be crazy to question her motivations. All told, she's developing into a good character, and I'm curious to see what Daemon will think about this development when they all get back together based on his history with Mysaria. Before it goes too far, they get interrupted by news that Seasmoke has a rider, which leads them to assume he's been claimed by the Greens rather than one of Corlys's bastards. This should help them rethink how they've been looking for potential riders. And even if you never read the book, you've probably picked up on some other potential candidates that may have been hidden in plain sight. Overall, I thought this was a great episode of TV, and my second favorite of the season so far. There are some major story changes, which I think are mostly fine. As a TV recapper, I had my issues with the way the first season was put together. As a fan of Martin's work, I was thrilled to see a lot of this stuff in glorious moving pictures, but felt it lacking in what I watched great TV for. So far, the second season has proven to be better, especially related to character development, and in some cases helped to justify some of those choices that seemed questionable in the first season. So at least for now, they've earned a wait-and-see attitude from me. And this episode took me on a ride and left me wanting more. There are some lore implications, and I thought it was funny that George R.R. Martin just randomly dropped a long blog post to fill in some details about the dragons in his universe last week. He seemed keen to clear up why his dragons are never nomadic, and how that would really screw things up, because if they just moved around, they'd be everywhere by now. Which I don't know, it might be a coincidence, but it also kind of sounds like he isn't happy with some of the changes the writers of the show are making. A dragon being in the Vale might confirm rumors that a pretty crucial character has been cut from the story. Also, having Adam be able to claim Seasmoke while Laenor is still alive as far as we know kind of contradicts things we think we know about dragons. But as I said at the beginning, it's all pretty mysterious. But more importantly, we've only seen their first meeting and don't know how they plan to explain that yet. If it still feels important after the next episode, I'll get into it then. So yeah, enjoy the ride, wait and see, and that feels like a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.